Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Public Programs Director of YIVO, and we're so pleased to have you here with us today for our book talk, Hope is Stronger Than Life, the Vilna Ghetto Diary of Zelig Kalmanovich, for which we're really so lucky to be with colleagues from the Vilna Gaon Museum and from the National Library of Lithuania. Today's talk is going to be moderated by Professor of History at Trinity College, Sam Kassow, who is also the author of Who Will Write Our History, which is a really wonderful chronicle of the Emanuel Ringelblum Oinig Shabbos project from the Warsaw Ghetto. So before we get started, just a brief word about YIVO. YIVO, for those that don't know, is a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an archive and library used by researchers from around the world with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books. And in addition to making these materials available to researchers, we have a variety of public programs like this. We have educational activities, including Yiddish classes and classes on Jewish literature, history, and culture. And we do exhibitions. And we have our latest exhibition chronicling the story of Jews and cannabis, which will be opening on May 5th here in New York City. It's called Am Yisrael High. And so if you're new to YIVO, we'll hope you'll join us again and stay tuned with all of our activities via our website, social media, and our email list. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Samuel Kassow, who's leading today's discussion. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for asking me to moderate this very important event, which recognizes the great Yiddish scholar Zelig Kalmanovich. I want to begin by mentioning how Max Weinreich, who was the pre-war director of the YIVO, tried to explain in 1935 why the YIVO's natural home was Vilna. Why not Berlin or New York? Cities that had more money and that had major universities. But it was in Vilna that the YIVO was established in 1925, and the Jews there even started the building before they had the money to finish it. More than once, the YIVO could not even afford to buy the postage stamps to schnorr money from the Jewish diaspora, but somehow a beautiful building went up on Vivulska Street, light, airy, and inviting, and YIVO became the crown jewel of Yiddish secular culture. Vilna was special, Weinreich stressed, because it had one quality that no other city in the Jewish world could match, and I quote, "Genius of place, a sense of history, embedded not only in the consciousness of the Jewish community, but that was also reflected in the resonance of the urban landscape itself," unquote. On the one hand, interwar Vilna was a poor city, even by Polish standards, where Jews were fighting an uphill battle against growing Polish efforts to turn them into second-class citizens. But on the other hand, Jewish Vilna overcame its poverty to become a symbol of cultural creativity and resilience in the Jewish world. Nochem Schiff, the critic, said, Peretz may have written in Warsaw, but he was read in Vilna. And the Yiddish poet Moshe Kulbach wrote, Yiddish ist der Posterkranz von Demmenblätter auf die Hereingang in die Heilige Woche von Stadt. Yiddish is the homely crown of oak leaves over the gates, sacred of profane into the city. Vilna was defined, Kulbach believed, by its Yiddish speech, and the uniqueness of the city transformed what had been profane and routine into something higher and better. By the 1930s, Vilna had become the uncrowned capital of a worldwide nation called Yiddishland, where the YIVO, in the words of Lucy Davidovich, served as, quote unquote, the ministry of Yiddish. And aside from Max Weinreich, no one was more important to the pre-war YIVO than Zelig Kalmanovich, who was the associate director and who did much of the day-to-day work that kept the institution going. He was born in Latvia in 1885. He had a traditional Jewish education. He was in a yeshiva until he was 15. And then he felt a drive to acquire secular learning. He took a high school exam in Liepaja in 1901. He then entered Berlin University. And after many efforts and many years of study, he acquired a doctorate in Semitic studies in Petrograd in 1919. But his real love was Yiddish, and he became an important Yiddish translator and a scholar of Yiddish literature. He married Riva Luria and their son Sholem, who later became the well-known Israeli scholar Sholem Luria, was born in 1920. Like many others, Kalmanovich shared Yud Lamed Peretz's vision of a creative Jewish culture that could underpin a secular Jewish identity. This would be a culture that drew on and did not reject the Jewish religious tradition. Kalmanovich had no patience for those who wanted to create a false dichotomy between Yiddish and Hebrew, between Jewish secularism and the Jewish religious tradition. And he despised communism and everything it stood for. In the YIVO, he, along with Weinreich, resisted efforts from certain leftists to politicize the institution. And he felt that culture was at least as important as politics. By the late 1930s, though, doubts began to creep in to Kalmanovich's private letters about the viability of Yiddish secular culture. He had never been a great believer in Zionism, but in 1939, he took a trip to Eretz Yisrael to visit his son Sholem, who was studying at the Hebrew University, and he was deeply impressed. And on the very eve of World War II, in the collection of essays at the crossroads Offenscheidweg, Kalmanovich expressed growing concern about the dilemma of the modern European Jew. In the Middle Ages, Jews had been protected by the armor of faith and national unity. The French Revolution and modernity might have emancipated Jews politically, but the Jew now facing Hitler, facing the collapse of European civilization, the modern Jew found himself stuck between two shores, no longer anchored in the Jewish religion, but rejected by a European world that they were trying to join. The invasion of Poland in 1939 was quickly followed after a short interlude by the Soviet takeover of Lithuania. And then in 1941, with the German invasion, Kalmanovich was forced, along with other Jews in Vilna, to move into the Vilna Ghetto. He was deported to Estonia in 1943, and there he perished in an Estonian labor camp in 1944. We're here today to talk about his extraordinary ghetto diary. This is a new publication by the Vilna Gaon Museum of Jewish History in Vilnius, and it's important for many reasons. It brings together the fragments of his diary that were already in the YIVO's collection in New York, and those parts of the manuscript that stayed in Vilnius. And this is the first ever publication in English of this important testimony. Translated by Olga Lempert, the book contains essays providing background and context from editors Stanislovas, Stasiulis, and Saulė Valiūnaitė. So the panel today is going to feature the two editors, Mr. Stasiulis and Ms. Valiūnaitė, joined by Lara Lempertienė, Dr. Lara Lempertienė, who's head of the Judaica Department of the Martynas Mažvydas National Library of Lithuania. So what I'd like to do now is to direct some questions to the panelists, and I'll invite them to respond. Question number one. Zelig Kalmanovich was an indefatigable worker, but he did not produce a lot of books. And yet he was greatly respected in Jewish Vilna. And in the Vilna Ghetto, he was called the prophet. What explained this? Why was he such an important figure in the YIVO and in the cultural world of pre-war Vilna? Who would like to respond to that question?
I would like to respond. As you mentioned, Kalmanovich acquired his doctoral degree in the Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and he began his professional career as a translator. He also worked as an editor in the famous Boris Kletskin publishing house in Vilnius. He also taught Yiddish and Hebrew. So these all jobs look like background work, you know. They are very important. Nothing happens without them, but they're crucial to any process. So as you also mentioned, when he joined YIVO, Kalmanovich did most of the administrative work. He also edited the YIVO publications. He worked with aspirants, the students at YIVO. He edited the I think I mentioned the publications. So although it looks like he didn't produce anything major, but he did a lot of background work, and he also took part in a lot of intellectual discussions on education, on issues of the Yiddish language, on issues of national identity, and so on and so forth. So we cannot judge just by the amount of the books.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone want to add to that? Yeah, Lara? You're
yeah, I see.
You're
yeah. Okay. I would really like to add a small maybe detail that the respect for Kalmanovich was not only for his own personality, although it is very important. Vilna was it was a very tight Jewish community, and in spite of all the conflicts that really that community, everybody was known to everybody else. So yes, Kalmanovich as a personality was very well respected, but the YIVO itself, the status of YIVO in Vilnius, and everybody who was associated with YIVO also added to that. And he was not only associated with YIVO, he was one of the holding talents of YIVO. And it was not so much, he wasn't not so much evaluated by exact kind of work that he did, but by his role in strategic planning for YIVO. He was co-director of YIVO, and like this person, like that kind of status, he was also very much respected.
Thank you very much.
You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'd now like to raise another question. I want to draw your attention to a diary entry of July 19th, 1942. I translated this myself before this English translation came out, so I'm reading my own translation. But he wrote this in the Vilna Ghetto on July 19th, 1942, and I quote, "When God decided to destroy Jewish Vilna, perhaps he had a purpose to hasten the redemption, warn those who could still be warned, tell them that there is no hope in the diaspora. Jewish Vilna was a model, an example for a Jewish community with its own unique culture in the diaspora. But many, too many, did not see the dangers that lurked in this culture. And now the temple of Golas Yiddishkeit, the temple of diaspora Jewry, is ruined. Her temple is forever destroyed. One didn't need the present Churban, one didn't need the present Holocaust to predict the destruction of Vilna Jewry." This is an extraordinary entry. Here, a secular Yiddishist who's given his whole life to the YIVO and who gave much of his life to Jewish Vilna, and who is calling Vilna the temple of diaspora Jewishness, is now saying that God, in the destruction of Jewish Vilna, is sending a message. Who would like to comment on this diary entry?
I would like to comment. This worldview has actually formed even before the Holocaust. Kalmanovich was politically active, was interested in politics, and supported Jewish political movements since his study years in Berlin. And as you mentioned, his political views shifted a little throughout the period, but for the most part, he supported the political movements that promoted the concept of Doikait, the concept which stated that the Jews can and should live in diaspora. They can keep their identity by creating a Yiddish culture, and Yiddish language itself would be something that would connect and shape them into one nation and keep them as a nation. But around 1933, when Hitler came into power in Germany, his political views began to change. It became apparent, and not only to him, to other people who supported diaspora nationalism as well. It became apparent that this idea of Doikait is not working. Yet younger generations are assimilating. So they are not keeping the national identity they wanted and hoped to keep while living in diaspora. So Kalmanovich shifted to supporting territorialist movements, first Freilandliga, and as you mentioned later, he became a supporter of Zionist ideas. So I think that is exactly what he says in this quote, that understanding that this was the idea of diaspora nationalism was a false idea. It was a nice idea, but it was impossible, to maintain Jewishness while living in diaspora.
Just for those in the audience who don't know, can you just say a few extra words about the territorialist movement? It was very popular in Vilna before the war, the Freilandliga and so on. What was it exactly that they were after?
Well, I can say only very briefly that they supported the idea that Jews should come together and live in kind of closed off communities to make sure that they avoid assimilation, avoid impact of other cultures, of culture of national majorities supporting them, so that they can keep their national identity.
Yeah, and for many in the territorialist movement, if one was worried about the future of Yiddish, then one had to see the importance of Jews living in a compact mass in a particular territory. That in a situation of territorial dispersion, there was no future for the Yiddish language. Again, this is something that Emanuel Ringelblum also wrote about in the Warsaw Ghetto. The next question that I'd like to raise concerns the cultural life in the Vilna Ghetto. The Vilna Ghetto was known for its creative cultural life, its theater, poetry, art, the folk song, the music in the Vilna Ghetto, the songs in the Vilna Ghetto, poets like Avram Sutzkever, the composers of popular music and song like Shmecher Kaczerginski and Durmashkin and Broide. There was a wonderful cabaret. Now, there were many in the ghetto, especially in the beginning of the ghetto, who were shocked when Jacob Gens proposed the establishment of a ghetto theater. The Bund put up pamphlets saying, in a Salem spielt nicht kein Theater, that you don't have a theater in a cemetery. But much to everybody's surprise, the theater and the cabaret and the cultural life became very popular in the ghetto. Herman Kruk, who kept an amazing diary of the Vilna Ghetto, at first was appalled at the idea of a theater, but he also came around and realized 2 months later that people want to live and people need culture. After the war, the Yiddish critic Shlomo Bellis wrote an essay about culture in the Vilna Ghetto called Kultur unterm Hack, Culture Under the Axe, in which he accused the cultural figures in the Vilna Ghetto of engaging in a kind of a collective narcotic experience. He called culture an escape from reality. The Germans didn't care if the Jews were writing poetry or going to the theater. It kept their minds off making trouble and preparing for armed resistance. And Bellis called the culture in the Vilna Ghetto a waste of time. Now, Kalmanovich, as we know, and we see a lot of evidence of this in the diary, was a great supporter of cultural activity in the ghetto. And he was very friendly, very close with some of the key cultural figures, including the poet Avram Sutzkever. Can you say more about this? Who would like to respond to this question?
Yes, you mentioned a lot of activities in the Vilna Ghetto, like library, because people borrowed books from the beginning till the liquidation of the Vilna Ghetto. Theater, poetry, even sport yard was constructed in the Vilna Ghetto, and Zelig Kalmanovich wrote about it also in his diary. But I think for those who there are several things. I think that like we already discussed, that Vilnius or Vilna was famous for the Jewish culture, for the printing houses, and for opening YIVO. So a lot of people who was active in the cultural field before the war, they wanted to create and write poetry even in the ghetto, but about the ghetto. So I think why we should think about culture in the Vilna Ghetto, why it is important and was important, that it led for the people to remain in life. It was also a huge support for them, and escape all those terrible actions, persecutions, etc. Also, it denied the policy of the Nazis, because they wanted to destroy not only the people but also to destroy their culture. So I think cultural life and cultural activities in the Vilna Ghetto was also, we can qualify as a part of resistance. Resistance not with the sword but with the pen in the hand. And Zelig Kalmanovich was also very active in cultural life. He worked at Vilna Ghetto Library as a deputy head of the library. He also was a co-founder and board chairman of Writers and Artists Union in the Vilna Ghetto. He was giving lectures about literature history, and so I think at this point culture and cultural life was also part of resistance, and also led people in the ghetto to escape reality.
Yeah, I just want to add that some people have kind of put forward the idea of a tension or a dichotomy between the idea of cultural resistance and armed resistance. But I'm thinking of, say, the memoirs of Yitzhak Zuckerman, who was active in the resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto and was a native of Vilna, and who said that when the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto and the youth movements first heard of the mass killings in Lithuania, and then they began to realize that the Germans intended to murder all the Jews, they told themselves, my God, we wasted so much time in seminars and in studying history and in putting on plays, and we should have been gathering arms. But after the war, Zuckerman realized that the cultural activities of the youth movements really prepared them for the armed resistance, and that without the spiritual and cultural preparation of 1940-41, the armed resistance of 1943 would not have been possible. And Dr. Mark Dvorzhetsky in Yerushalayim Dlit in Kampfenumkum, his memoirs of the Vilna Ghetto, said that even the cabarets in the Vilna Ghetto served as a powerful antidote to depression and to passivity, and gave people a will to live. And it's interesting that if you look at some of the most popular songs composed in the Vilna Ghetto, Moshe Haltzech, Moshe Hold On, Pesha Funresha, about a spunky teenage girl who's going to live no matter what, these carried a clear message of psychological resilience. I now want to ask you, what do you make of those parts of the diary where Kalmanovich is expressing support for the commandant of the Vilna Ghetto, Jacob Gens? Jacob Gens was a tragic figure. There are those who condemn him. I think many more Jews, many more survivors of the Vilna Ghetto look at him with understanding, although they probably didn't love him, but they understood that he meant the best and he was in a terrible situation. But there's a case where Gens is sending Jewish police to help in a selection victims in the Ushmana Ghetto. And of course, Gens then explains to the ghetto intelligentsia, he says, ich mach nicht kein Cheshem von Yiddish Kavod, ich mach a Cheshem von Yiddish Blut. I'm not relying on Jewish honor, I'm making my account with Jewish blood. If I can save Jewish lives, I'll sacrifice some honor. And by sending the police to Ushmana, he said that there were fewer victims, and the victims who were chosen were the old and the sick. And then he tried to explain his behavior to the intelligentsia in the ghetto. And Kalmanovich defended Gens and defended Gens's action in his diary. And I'm wondering what you think of Kalmanovich's willingness to support the actions of the commandant.
I think Kalmanovich thought that, and he actually writes in his diary that Gens and his commanders, they were also hostages of those circumstances, and their tasks ordered by Germans. So he thought that they are also victims like everyone in the ghetto, and that is why he thought that and supported Gens' position. And actually, when we're speaking about Gens, we can see two groups in the ghetto. One group of people who supported Gens and his position that working and productive ghetto gives more chances to survive and to survive. Another group who supported FPO and armed resistance, who underlined that from the beginning that Nazis wants to destroy everyone, and it is only a question of time, then they will liquidate the whole ghetto and all the people. So Kalmanovich was one of those people who supported Gens and Gens' position, because he also agreed with him that productive and working ghetto gives more chances to survive, while FPO makes risk for the ghetto and for the ghetto existence. But actually, now when we are reading this in Kalmanovich diary, it is a shocking entries about how he supports Gens. But actually, like I said, it was not only Kalmanovich who supported Gens, and even some survivors from the Vilna Ghetto also speaks now that we just made one interview with a survivor of the Holocaust from the Vilna Ghetto, and when we asked him, did you support Gens or FPO? So he told us that I supported Gens line, because I thought that to be a member of armed underground is too risky for me, and I thought that Gens' position was right and we should follow him. So actually, it was not only Kalmanovich who fought like this and supported Gens and his commanders in the Vilna Ghetto.
Lara, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just a small thing. We could say it's a paradox that Kalmanovich, who in his diary, throughout the diary, expresses strong notion of the last generation. He sees himself and all who surrounds him here as people who are bound to die, to perish, and in much more broad perspective, he knows about people in other ghettos and all the Jewry in Eastern Europe. So the question is why he is supporting theater, and why he supports Gens and not the resistance. I think that's exactly because of that melancholic notion that everybody here will die anyway. So everybody of his community is very dear to him. He is not prepared to condemn anybody, even if he himself wouldn't maybe choose to sing cabaret songs or something else. We can compare this with several, even many entries in the diary when he so lovingly writes about Jewish children who are given the possibility of sport activities, competitions of different kinds, cultural competitions, because he knows actually they are maybe most probably their last days on the earth. So he wants them and everybody to at least spend those days in respect and in such comfort as to be had.
Okay, thank you. One of the most intriguing, some of the most intriguing parts of the diary concern Kalmanovich's condemnation of armed resistance, his condemnation of the FPO, of the partisan organization in the Vilna Ghetto, that even though he was close personally to Abba Kovner, who after Wittenberg was killed by the Germans, Abba Kovner took over the command of the FPO. Even though Kalmanovich was close to Kovner on a personal level, he rejected the idea of armed resistance. He compared the resistors to the zealots in the time of the Second Temple, who brought catastrophe on the Jewish people. It's remarkable if you compare the Vilna and the Warsaw ghettos that what made the Warsaw Ghetto uprising possible was not the existence of Jewish fighting organizations, but the fact that, as Javi Dreyfus has pointed out in her last book, you had massive support of the non-combatant Jewish population for the idea of armed resistance. The Jews built 750 bunkers in Warsaw. They supported the idea of fighting back. This is what made the Warsaw Ghetto uprising possible. In Vilna and in Białystok, the fighters did not have the support of the majority of the ghetto population. They supported Barash in Białystok, they supported Gens in Vilna, in part because in Białystok and in Vilna, you had Jewish leaders like Gens and Barash who still could make the Jews believe that there was some hope, that there was the possibility that by working hard, they might survive. In Warsaw, that hope was gone. The Jews had no illusions. But even with that said, Kalmanovich's strictures, his opposition to the fighters, people who today are remembered as great heroes, his opposition to these people is very, very striking. And I'm wondering who'd like to comment about this.
Yes, he was against armed resistance, and like we already spoke, he supported Gens, and he thought that armed resistance is a responsible activity which makes a huge risk for the whole ghetto and people imprisoned in the ghetto. And one interesting thing that Abba Kovner, after the war in 1979, he said that he even tried to change Kalmanovich's mind, and he spoke to him twice and asked for his moral support for the armed organization. But like you said already, even the even this didn't change Kalmanovich's mind, and he thought that armed resistance in the ghetto is a responsible and risky activity for all the people in the ghetto. So I think that is why he didn't support it, armed resistance and FPO, and was in the line of Yakov Gens.
Thank you. A final question. I read the entry of December 27th, 1942, and I'm still amazed, where Kalmanovich is writing the following. Extinction through a loving caress leaves no impression and has no meaning in the eyes of others. Eventually, the Jewish people itself will forget the broken branch that has fallen off it. It will need to survive without it, to grow new branches, leaves, and buds from the healthy trunk. Dying and rot happen to every tree. Millennia lie ahead. And I just want to read a couple more passages from this diary entry. People of the ghetto, your memory will be honored throughout history. The tiniest of your expressions will be studied. Your struggle for humanity will inspire poets. Your moral oppression will arouse anger and indignation. Forever shall your murderers be pilloried. The world of humans shall observe them with terror, be filled with fear for itself, and endeavor to avoid the sin. Why was this done to that nation, they shall ask? And the answer shall be, such is the fate of the evildoer who has destroyed the Jews of Eastern Europe. This is how the tragedy will be preserved in history in the chronicles of nation. And then to repeat, extinction through a loving caress leaves no impression and has no meaning in the eyes of others. This is an amazing entry, because here in December 1942, in the middle of what we've come to call the Holocaust, Kalmanovich is saying, had the Holocaust not happened, and had the Germans never come, the Jews of Eastern Europe would probably have disappeared on their own. They didn't have the cultural vitality in the diaspora to continue. We've already discussed this. But because the Germans have come and they're murdering them, this is such a moral shock, not just to the Jews, but to the entire world, that it will lay the foundation for a revived Jewish people living in its own land. This may be the first attempt ever to try to attach some meta-historical meaning to the Holocaust while it was going on in real time. And I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts about this.
As I see that nobody's volunteering yet, I would actually be very interested in your thoughts, Sam, on that, on your interpretation of that passage.
My interpretation is, is one that Kalmanovich, by 1940, had become even more disillusioned with Deutschkeit and with the prospects for a Jewish diaspora culture. Number one. Number two, he also, as he wrote to his son in 1939, the 400,000 Jews in Palestine are 100 times more important to the Jewish people than the 4 million Jews in America who have no cultural vitality. The point I'm making here is that Kalmanovich was not concerned with numbers. He was concerned with the cultural foundation of the Jewish people. He was concerned with the spiritual foundation of the Jewish people. His reading of Jewish history is that even if great numbers were destroyed, if a cultural core survived, that core would enable the people to renew itself. In this meta-historical interpretation, even though the Holocaust was destroying East European Jewry, at the same time, it was making possible a revitalization and renewal of Jewish life in the land of Israel that might not have been possible without this disaster, and that this would be the ultimate meaning and vindication of the suffering that the Jews were going through in Eastern Europe. It's kind of a radical nationalism where the people who are being murdered are seen as sacrifices in a wider historical process.
Thank you, but now I would still like to add again a small detail. Nevertheless, he actually believed in Jewish future not only in the land of Israel. And I remember another passage from the diary when he records how he get to know that in the YIVO in New York, which was before the war, of course, only a branch of YIVO against the main center in Vilnius. So now the only YIVO regiment in New York held some kind of conference, and someone gave him this piece of news, and he rejoices on that, and he rose in a way I don't quote exactly, but he thanks God who destroys meager wooden buildings, and instead of them, he builds miraculous, beautiful palaces. And he adds, and YIVO lives in America. So it comes through his own sentiment to his own home institution of which he was a part. So he actually sees more opportunities for the Jews to revive their cultural life in different places of the world, even if everybody will perish, or most will perish in Eastern Europe, and certainly Jewish cultural life in Eastern Europe is no more possible. And he was almost right.
Yeah, I mean, he and Crook were very, very happy to that they heard that from Pole that there was a YIVO meeting in New York, and he was very happy. But all I'm saying is that based on his letter to his son before the war, what he was saying is that qualitatively the Yishuv in Palestine counted more than the millions of Jews in the United States. But certainly he didn't write off. He was happy that the YIVO was surviving. But I think the main point was that he was his belief in Jewish continuity and in the and in the future of the Jewish people was not totally dependent on the existence of any particular national center. Like Dubnov, he believed that centers of Jewish history could switch from country to country, and that the East European Jewish era was over, and that did not necessarily mean the end of the Jewish people. Okay, Alex, are we going to have
Yeah,
questions?
so we have some audience questions. So one question points at an interesting linguistic thing that hasn't been touched on. One audience member asks if the diary will be translated into Hebrew, which it actually, in fact, most of it was written in Hebrew originally. So maybe we could take a moment to just let everyone know, why do you think that Kalmanovich would have written this diary in Hebrew, given that his work was so central in Yiddish? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about the publication history.
The publication history is very difficult to explain and to tell in short period of time. But I will focus on the Hebrew ones. So the diary, as Alex mentioned, was written in Hebrew, and Kalmanovich's son, Shalom Luria, has published it, the part of the diary that is being preserved at YIVO. So he published half of it in Hebrew in 1972, I think. And then a renewed edition, full text of the diary was published, prepared for publication by the son of Kalmanovich, but he passed away. So the work was finished by his grandson, Yuval Luria, and it was published in 2011, I think. I will check after the discussion and I will write it at the Q&A. So it was published in full in Hebrew. If anyone is interested, there's a possibility to read it in the original, basically.
Okay. Is there anything to say about why he may have written this in Hebrew as opposed to in Yiddish? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Lara.
Yeah, I would say it's not only the language in which the diary is written, also the sense of religious meaning of Jewish existence, or lack of that meaning that pervades the diary. I think he was, during his time in ghetto, Kalmanovich, who was prepared to this kind of thinking by all his immense erudition and his being actually a scholar in Semitic studies. He also gave a lot of thought to the philosophical, I might say, meaning of Jewish life. And of course, it's so natural to return to all Jewish texts, to classical Jewish texts, of which he quotes very much, and even more, he hides half quotes and associations with those texts in his own writing. So to return to Hebrew was like to return to the foundations of the Jewish cultural life on the very verge of Jewish physical existence.
Thank you very much. Just a quick note, I see a bunch of questions coming in the chat. Please do write those in the Q&A. That's where we're keeping track of all the questions rather than the chat. And then also just a quick note to say that we have a lot of questions here, which we won't have time for everything. So I apologize in advance for that, but we'll get through as much as we can. Lara, your answer really dovetails nicely with a question from Cecile Kuznets. Cecile, for those that don't know, is the chronicler of YIVO's own history, has a wonderful book about YIVO's history. Cecile asks if everyone could reflect more on what she refers to as the most difficult aspect of Kalmanovich's views that are reflected in this diary, which is the belief that the destruction of European Jewry was a form of divine punishment. Which very much dovetails, I think, with this idea of a kind of biblical precedence for the way that he's thinking and writing.
Sam, would you answer to that?
I find this very difficult. I cringe when I read this, and it's something that I really hate to talk about. But, you know, especially because there are those in Eastern Europe who are very quick, as one example, to say, find a moral alibi by accusing Jews of whoring after the communists when they came and occupied territories in 1939, 1940, including Lithuania. Now, to some degree, Kalmanovich is saying that large sections of Jewish youth threw their Jewishness overboard. They forgot about their Zionism. They forgot about their previous allegiances, and they ran to join the communists. And, this is exactly what certain anti-Semites say. And I think Kalmanovich was saying this, he was writing this in the ghetto. He was under great emotional strain. He, as I said before, he was very, very angry at Jewish communists before the war and what they were doing to Jewish culture. And I think his sense of the historical dialectic was such that to say that this was divine punishment for having taken a false road, in his mind, by 1942, this made absolute sense, because Kalmanovich is writing elsewhere in the diary that there's a triad. There's the Torah, there's the land of Israel, and there's the Jewish people. And believing in the triad, meaning believing in the Torah, this would then translate into the belief that these sufferings were punishment for very serious sins that Jewish people had committed. I'm trying to describe what he's thinking. I'm not condoning it. I'd love to hear what Cecile has to say about this, but this is just my attempt to explain what he's thinking.
Any other thoughts on this before I go on to the next question? It's a very difficult one. Okay, apropos of that, one viewer asked about Kalmanovich as someone who is secular within a religious environment, which maybe perhaps someone could explain a little bit more about religion in the Vilna community and Kalmanovich's relationship to it, and the way that he fit into it.
Maybe I will answer in short as the time is ending. And I would like to answer actually in quote by Max Weinreich, who wrote during the interwar that in Vilnius, Jewish traditions match the Jewish present. Only from these two elements together can a Jewish cultural future be built. Secular and traditional religious culture went maybe not in hand in a meaning that they were very fond of each other, but they lived close to each other, even in the Schulhof, in the same yard where the great synagogue stood. Right around the corner, there was a Velfkes restaurant where all the bohemia of Yiddish world, used to come, actors after the theater, after the productions of the plays, and all the writers and so on. So this religious world and secular world, they were perfectly fine, one next to another in Vilnius.
And also, speaking of Kalmanovich precisely, is, as I said already, his huge knowledge of religious tradition and Jewish classical texts as a scholar. He couldn't be separated from the understanding religious patterns of life, even if he himself was not a traditionalist and maybe not such keeper of a tradition on a everyday basis, and he wasn't. But he knew the role. He could evaluate the role of the religious tradition maybe better than anyone.
Thank you so much. So a lot of wonderful questions here. We don't have time for everything, but I'd like to end on a positive question, which is, could you all perhaps reflect on what is something interesting or surprising that you encountered in working on this project that you'd like readers to take away from this new publication?
I think that, Stanislovas is actually working more on the topic of the Holocaust, and he could tell much more about all the diaries written in the Vilna Ghetto. But I think, others, like, for example, Crook, they document what happened. And Kalmanovich wrote what it felt like. Even reading the diary, you feel the declining mood, and you feel the how more and more tired people are getting from the tension, after some time. So it really shows how people felt living under in such a tragical circumstances.
For me, it was a real challenge. I only made a small impact as a consultant to the book, but for me it was a real challenge because I'm not as a rule working with the Holocaust topics, but I needed that because we have so little actual voices preserved from the past. And if it is a voice from the ghetto, from the from the very bottom of Jewish existence, of the existence of the Eastern Europe, it is all the more important. And it was my own encounter, maybe the deepest one, with this topic, and through such a meaningful and such wise voice as Kalmanovich's was. It was so enriching. It was so challenging, but also very much enriching.
I think that each diary written in the ghetto in Vilnius or in another ghetto is very important and the exceptional, because it shows how people felt and what they thought at that time and in that place. So, like, I agree what Saulė and Lara already told, that if you know the history of the Vilna Ghetto and the Holocaust, so here you can, Kalmanovich is not speaking very much about the facts about the daily life, but you can feel what other people in the Vilna Ghetto felt at that moment and how they lived during those terrible times.
On that note, thank you all so much for joining us for this talk today, and congratulations on this very important publication. It's available in English and also in Lithuanian, and we've shared the link in the chat. Yeah, thank you very much. Lots to continue discussing in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.